Hello, hunters, and welcome back to Super Fan Natural. One of the things that helps make Supernatural so popular is the fact that it belongs to a specific subgenre of fantasy known as contemporary fantasy. Basically, instead of taking place in some high fantasy world like Narnia or Westeros, the show is instead set in a fictional version of our modern-day world, where things are relatively the same as reality, except for the fact that monsters are real and secretly walk amongst regular folks. One of the most important elements of contemporary fantasy is explaining how it's possible for monsters to exist in our world without being discovered by the general public. Some stories use a kind of magical veil or filter that keeps normies from seeing the supernatural. Others employ a secret society that covertly covers creatures' chaos. One of the things that makes Supernatural unique in the genre is that it doesn't really have one specific mechanism for concealing the existence of weird stuff. Most creatures inherently seem to operate on the down low, and sometimes regular folks who encounter them will have their memories wiped. However, in many cases, people who cross paths with the paranormal and survive just live with the knowledge of what they experienced. Couple that with the fact that monsters and magic have been around for all of human history, and many fans have been led to ask an obvious question: how the hell is it possible for this stuff to be secret in the modern day? I mean, it makes sense that most people who learn the truth wouldn't feel like talking about it, but statistically, you're bound to have a few blabbermouths who feel compelled to reveal the supernatural to the general public for one reason or another. Also, both monsters and hunters can be a bit sloppy, and you'd figure that eventually, something they do or leave behind would make its way to the internet or something. The point is, in the absence of some kind of standardized method for obfuscating, it can be a bit confusing as to how and why the supernatural remains a secret. So in this video, I'll explain all the things that keep the existence of creepy creatures concealed. First, let's start by going over what the show directly says about the matter, because questions about the secrecy do come up from time to time. While it's not overtly stated, we can piece together bits of dialogue throughout the series to conclude that many creatures intentionally stay out of the public eye because too much attention will attract hunters. That explanation works to an extent. However, it's not exactly airtight. For starters, it's not like all beasties of the world are organized and sworn to uphold the veil of secrecy. We see several freaks who just don't mind being more open than others. Also, it's not like randos can't accidentally stumble into paranormal power. We saw at least 2 occasions in which random nerds with no wider knowledge of the supernatural find real spell books and perform real magic. So what exactly stops other idiots from unleashing unstoppable magic that ends up making the headlines? There's also the fact that the Winchesters were acknowledged by government officials to die and then mysteriously show up alive several times throughout the series. Usually, this gets explained as a trick of some sort. However, on one occasion, this leads to the body of a shapeshifter being exhumed for examination, which we just never get any follow-up about. What I'm trying to say is that even if every inhuman creature was dedicated to keeping the secret, there's still plenty of ways that the existence of magic and monsters could accidentally be revealed, and yet it just doesn't. How? Why? Whomst? Fear not, dear viewer, I've got the deets. The first possible explanation is both the simplest and the most boring. God Almighty used his power to influence events in order to keep certain aspects of the world hidden. Yep, the easiest explanation is that God made it so. Need I say more? Well, yeah. I don't think I have to explain how God could pull that off. He's God. Supernatural's version might not be quite all-powerful, but he still wields more influence than any other being. All you need to do to explain any weird occurrences in the show is say, God done did it. Why haven't people noticed the monsters? God wrote in a standing order into the fabric of the universe that keeps creatures from getting too public. Why haven't demons conquered the world? God wrote that they just wouldn't. In fact, at one point in the series, it's actually stated outright that this is the answer. In season 15, God showed Sam a potential future in which he's locked away, and as a result, monsters rise up and plunge the world into chaos. If we assume that he wasn't lying, which there's a good chance he was, it means that we have our answer. God maintains the status quo. Like I said, this explanation is simple, yet boring. So yeah, the most likely answer to this mystery is that God did it. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that that isn't the case. Let's assume that, while Chuck might pull a few strings in order to keep this story interesting, he isn't the one sweeping all of the evidence under the rug every minute of every day. If that were the case, then how could we explain this massive secret staying a secret, even in the age of smartphones and the internet? I think the first question we have to answer is, could this all just be self-regulated? Could all the demons and all the monsters and miscellaneous freaks just take it upon themselves to hide from the general public? At first, it seems completely impossible, especially since it's not like all of these evil things work together as a united front against humans and hunters. Hell, it's not even like each individual species is capable of banding together perfectly. Sometimes, all of demondom will submit to a single ruler, and on rare occasions, we do see large and diverse groups of monsters forming coherent organizations. But even then, the factions don't really work together. So how can we possibly believe that all creatures would follow some unspoken rule about exposure? Well, for demons, there's a relatively simple answer. All of Hell's rulers wanted demons to remain a secret. Azazel and Lilith had specific plans that required strategy to pull off, and having their henchmen on national news would probably complicate things a bit. Lucifer let his demons have a little bit more fun, but it seems like he was still holding them back a bit until after the showdown with Michael. Also, during that time, angels were out and about, and might have been wiping some memories, but that's just speculation. Post-apocalypse, Hell's throne was seized by Crowley, who's one of the smartest and sneakiest demons in the show. I believe that Crowley was smart enough to understand that humanity knowing about the supernatural is not only bad for business, it's a threat to the survival of all monster kind. See, here's the thing. About 80% of the creatures in Supernatural aren't actually all that hard to deal with under the right circumstances. Like, yeah, monsters are strong and capable of tanking damage that would take down regular people. But as a species, humanity is really good at killing things, mostly because they have the gift of finding effective and efficient ways to wipe out any species that they find displeasing. Firearms, pesticides, antibiotics, or just good old-fashioned mobs. Humans are the most destructive species on the planet, rivaled only by microorganisms, and sometimes they'll even weaponize germs to help eradicate their enemies. Now, it's true that most creatures are stronger and hardier than regular animals, but they still have weaknesses that can be exploited. And as I've just said, humans are experts at exploiting weaknesses. The secrecy of the supernatural is a huge benefit to monsters because it means that most random folks aren't going to be carrying around silver or holy water. But if the general public ever found out that all of the creepy creatures that lurk in the shadows are real, I mean, everyone is going to be packing, and that's actually the best possible outcome for monsterdom. See, in Season 12, we learned something kind of interesting about werewolves. Thanks to the British Men of Letters, we found out that lycanthropes have a fatal allergy to sulfate gas. It's a minor detail, but it shows us that at least some common monsters have weaknesses that hunters might not know about, ones that could be exploited far easier than carrying around silver weapons. I can easily see a scenario in which humans manage to use weaponized chemistry and engineering to make the world completely hostile to monsters and demons. And I think that the smarter creatures realize this too. They know that hiding in the shadows as nightmares of legend works to their advantage, and they work to keep their existence a secret. If that sounds too ridiculous, then consider this. If humans find themselves on the losing side of a monster war, then they'll probably just resort to the literal nuclear option and just waste the entire planet in a desperate, spiteful hope to take down the creeps with them. Remember, folks, love isn't actually the most powerful force in the world. Spite is. So I definitely think that this is a strong possibility. But let's still explore another avenue. What if instead of all that, there was actually a shady secret society that dedicated itself to covering up the existence of the paranormal, Men in Black style? Now, I know what you're thinking. Jack, you beautiful caked up legend. There isn't an organization like that in the show. You even said so yourself earlier in this very video. Well, here's the thing. While there's no global cabal of supernatural secret keepers, there are a few groups shown throughout the series that do have the resources, influence, and motivation to clean up at least some potential exposures. The most obvious of these would be the Men of Letters, a secret society of scholars who research the paranormal in order to uncover the inner workings of monsters and magic. The Men of Letters is kind of a weird organization. We don't get much information about its origins or history before the 20th century. Part of its operation involves fighting monsters. In fact, by the 21st century, the British moles had developed a pretty slick and effective system in which cities like London were magically warded to detect monsters, and when one popped up, they'd send out highly trained field agents armed with mystical tech to slay the beast and tie up loose ends. We don't get too much information about how the Brits deal with witnesses, but we do see that they're willing to put down folks whose knowledge of the weird could cause problems. The American branch of the Lettermen were nuked back in the 50s, so we don't get nearly as much info about how their club operated. However, we do know that they would occasionally send people out into the field in order to investigate para-problems. One thing that both branches have in common is that they're each shown using sorcery in their day-to-day operations in one way or another. And when you add up their whole secret society shtick, it becomes really easy to imagine them swooping in and doing a little magic cleanup in cases where monsters might have otherwise become common knowledge. Now, based on what we saw in the show, it really doesn't seem like that's what happens, or at the very least, it wasn't a common occurrence. But who knows for sure? The Alphabet Boys were all about secrets on top of secrets, and we didn't even know about them until almost exactly halfway through the series, so maybe their cleaner division was the most secretest of them all. The Men of Letters were the show's most notable secret club, but not its only one. There was another group of freaky humans who did some really sussy stuff from behind the scenes of society, and who just may have played a role in keeping monsters actively on the down low. In Season 10, we met a culty little family known as the Steins, who admitted to secretly being behind some pretty nasty world events throughout history. The basic gist is that these dudes use dark money, shadowy influence, and a pinch of black magic to control and shape the world to their own benefit. One of their members openly admitted that the fam is behind a number of world events, including 9/11. Maybe part of their devious doings involves covering up potential supernatural exposures. I mean, there's no real evidence of this, but think about it. If your family's whole super secret shtick relies on magic to control the world, well, you probably don't want the general public knowing about the existence of magic, and by extension, magical creatures. So, perhaps the Great House of Frankenstein took it upon themselves to monitor the world for signs of noticeable cryptid activity, and if something posed a real risk of exposure, they'd swoop in and take it out. Not the most likely scenario on this list, but it is possible. Alright, so there's one final possibility that I want to touch on, and while it's probably the least likely, I think it's one of the most interesting. What if the existence of the entire supernatural side of the universe is kept hidden from regular mortals by pure luck? I know, it sounds super dumb, but you gotta understand what exactly luck is in Supernatural. Within the canon of the show, luck is an actual force or power within the universe. We don't know exactly how it works, just that it causes probabilities to work in your favor, and the more luck you have working for you, the more you'll find yourself on the winning end of seemingly impossible odds. For example, luck can make it so that a person or thing that you're looking for just falls right into your lap. It can make it so that you're in the exact right place at the exact right time to prevent something really bad from happening. It makes me wonder, could monsters be kept secret because any time that they might end up exposed, the forces of luck cause hunters to stumble upon their specific cases, and they swoop in just in time to keep things hidden? Like, it sounds nuts, but I don't know. I think it's at least sorta plausible. We don't really know how luck is distributed naturally. For all we know, just the act of becoming a hunter grants you a little extra luck, allowing you to catch a whiff of monster activity right when it needs to be snuffed out. Maybe being or becoming a supernatural being leads to a decreased luck stat in order to compensate for the extra power. Hell, maybe it's both, or neither. That would help create a nice balance, wouldn't it? This might be one of the less plausible explanations, but I genuinely think it's a pretty neat way to make sense of this mystery. But what do you guys think? How do you personally justify monsters and magic staying on the down low? Let me know down below. I'll have more content for you soon, but for now, carry on.